I will be gracious, chanokti, to whom I will be gracious, achon, and I will show mercy, rachamti, on whom I will show mercy, arachem. Okay, you can see similar letters in those words, no? You add extra letters to give words different meanings. Exile has shaped the Jews' experience of the world. This is the Arch of Titus. It was made in Rome somewhere in the 1st century to celebrate the fact that Titus destroyed the temple. The first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century, and the people went into exile. We believe that the Torah was canonized sometime after this. The Edict of Cyrus called people back. The prophets, they were canonized in the late Persian or the early Hellenistic period. So these texts didn't reach their final form until just before the time of Jesus, just before the time of the Roman occupation. The Greek occupation is before that. That's 333 to 63. And the Ketuvim were canonized around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. One of the Jewish people's responses to tragedy is to go to their scriptures. In Deuteronomy we hear, because the Lord your God is merciful, is a merciful God, Rachum. God will neither abandon you nor destroy you. God will not forget the covenant with your ancestors that God swore to them. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion, chameka, on you, gathering you again from all the people amongst whom the Lord your God has scattered you. It's there continually. How am I going for time? I've lost track of where I am. Okay, good. I'm going to ignore the Passover, the Last Supper, which we connect. And I'm going to go to the main text that I want to study today. This is Exodus 34, 6 to 7. I'm going to read it in a translation that you're probably not familiar with. It's by a guy called Everett Fox. Everett Fox is a Jewish scholar who tried to translate the Torah into English in order to preserve the rhythm of the text, the sound of the text, the flavor of the text. Because the Hebrew language is a very different one to English. The text was originally an oral text, and so there are lots of patterns, there's lots of repetition, there's lots of allusions to other things. And he doesn't translate the name of God. Yod He Vav He. Scholars will say it's probably translated as Yahweh. Once upon a time in the 16th century, a German biblical scholar confused it with the vowels that are underneath it and called it Jehovah. The Jews put vowels underneath it in the current text to remind them not to say it. They put the vowels of another word. The word is Adonai. Adonai means my Lord. Most of you, in your Old Testaments, unless you have the Jerusalem Bible, will have the word Lord in small capital letters or capital letters throughout that text. Okay? That's where this is. I use a phrase called the eternal to pronounce that word. Because when God revealed God's name, God said, I am who I am. But the word is kind of vague. It's kind of not quite a whole word. And it comes from the verb to be. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. I am being who I am being. There's a sense that God is eternal. So when we encounter this name, this word, we are encountering this sense of God as eternal, and something else in a minute. And the eternal passed before Moses' face and called out, the eternal, God, showing mercy, showing favor, long-suffering in anger, abundant in loyalty and faithfulness. We're hearing some of the words we've already heard here. Keeping loyalty to the thousandth generation. We heard part of this in the talk this morning. It was one of the bits that I could understand. Bearing iniquity, rebellion and sin, yet not clearing the guilty, calling to account the iniquities of the parents on their children, and upon the children's children to the fourth generation. I need to be fair to all the sons and fathers here. Okay, we often change the gender, except when it says bad things about men. I was raised by feminist nuns. And I'm glad. Walter Brueggemann, who is a Protestant scholar, an incredible scholar, a man who I understand about half of what I've read of what he's written. He's sometimes just way too intelligent for me to quite get what he's on about. He says this, and I do get this. The proclamation begins with the double utterance, the eternal, the eternal. This double utterance enunciates and makes powerfully present the majestic, inscrutable sovereignty of the eternal in the life of Israel. Verses 6 and 7 then are an exegesis of the content of that name, which divides into two parts. This is an exegesis of what God is. It's an exegesis of Israel's experience of God. According to Brueggemann, this is kind of like the introduction. And the eternal passed before Moses' face and called out, the eternal God. Now we get to the 7 bits. It's the 7 positive terms that are used to describe God. Number 1, Rachum. God is a God who shows mercy. Hanun. God shows favor to people. But we know that both of those words already, from our brief textual study, mean mercy and compassion. Long-suffering in anger. Erek apayim. It actually means God with a long nose. It's an idiom for long-suffering. In other words, God is patient. God can wait. Okay, when you're the eternal, a little bit of time is not much, huh? 4, God is abundant in loyalty. Rav chesed. Okay? Literally, God has great loyalty. Love is great, many, big, large. And faithfulness. Interestingly here, the Hebrew word is emet, which means truth. Yet it's traditionally translated as faithful. God is faithful. This is the truth of God. God is faithful. 2 to go. Keeping loyalty, chesed, to the 1000th generation. Okay? That's a long time. 1,000 generations. And bearing, the Hebrew word here is nasa, which can also be translating as forgiving. and bearing iniquity, rebellion, and sin. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but God will forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin. Now, this story, does anyone know what it just comes after? It comes after the golden calf. Okay, Moses is up there on the mountain, 40 days, 40 nights, not eating, no merienda. He obviously wasn't Filipino. Or me. And while he's up there, the Israelites are down there partying. Okay, they've got the golden calf, they've got the karaoke, they're singing, they're dancing. And Moses comes down and finds that. And Moses is pretty angry. He gets the 10 Commandments and he smashes them. And God is pretty angry too. So this revelation of what God is comes after this experience of the Israelites turning their back on God. On the Israelites not trusting God. And there are two negative terms that Brueggemann identifies. Yet not clearing the guilty, manache yanoleche. The emphasis there, the word repeated. Okay, I'm not letting you off. Twice. And calling people to account. Pakad. This is the reality. We believe in a God who is infinitely merciful. We believe in a God who is infinitely loving and loyal. But you know what? We have to face the consequences of the things that we do wrong. Okay? That's the reality. Can you imagine, if we didn't? And there are many people who don't face the consequences of their misdemeanors and sins. Many of us face the consequences of them on their behalf. Okay? Now there's another reading of this. When Jews read this, and I like this, Brueggemann found 7 plus 2. 7 plus 2 equals 9. Okay, the Jews find 13. Okay? And this passage is really important. Wow. That moved really nicely. Because it's used in Jewish liturgy. When Jews pray on special occasions, they use this passage. And it's recited aloud in the synagogue on festivals, not on Shabbat. Shabbat's a day off. Okay, Shabbat we don't ask God for things. We just celebrate the fact that we're alive. Well, okay, Jews do. I take out we, they do. Okay. And they do it when they take out the Torah, the scroll, from the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, they take it out, they hold it up, everybody gets really, really excited, they get their prayer shawls and they touch the Torah with their prayer shawl. Okay, it's a religious, profoundly moving experience for Jewish people to encounter the Torah. And it's used in the Selachot, the penitential prayers that are recited on fast days and during the High Holy Day, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the day where Jews collectively recognize that they have sinned. And living in Israel, that's a really interesting experience at the moment because there is a lot of sin, particularly in the way that people are treating one another, particularly in the way that the Israeli Defense Force, that some Jews are treating the Palestinian people. And so you have at this time of Yom Kippur, this dialogue happening, saying unless we change the way we treat the Palestinian people, we're going to end up like the Egyptians. So it's an interesting thing. It causes them, some of them, it's like us too, okay? There's a religious ideal and there's a religious real. Okay, I live in the real most of the time and aspire to the ideal. Now, it's interesting. God's recital of these moral qualities was intended to set the pattern for Israel's future petitions to God. And the idea is to inculcate the human imitation of God's moral qualities. To remind ourselves of what God is, who God is, how God relates to us. Compassion, graciousness, forbearance, kindness, fealty, and forgiveness. We remind ourselves that God loves us. We remind ourselves, before we ask anything of God, that God is great. And this maybe blows our mind. This is a good picture, maybe slightly out of context. It's moved around a few times in the presentation and it's ended up here. When we read the Bible, is this what's going on? Or is this what's going on? Or this? This is not the train I came in on this morning. But are we like this kid here? So another reading. How do they get 13? Again, introduction. Number 1, the eternal. This is an attribute of God. I'll explain why in a minute. Number 1. Number 2, the eternal. Number 3, God. Number 4, showing mercy, showing favor, long-suffering in anger, abundant in loyalty and faithfulness, keeping loyalty to the 1000th generation, bearing iniquity and rebellion and sin. God is triply forgiving. 3 qualities. God forgives iniquity. God forgives rebellion. God forgives sin. Yet not clearing the guilty. And that's a reminder. All of these things, God is generous, God is loving, God has chesed, God has achim, but God's not going to forget. We still have to face the consequences of what we do wrong. So, mercy is God's name. The traditional interpretation of the divine name is that it discloses God's attribute of mercy in contrast to Elohim, which is the other name which we generally translate as God, which discloses God's attribute of justice. God is merciful, God is just. And the repetition of the name was meant to mean that God is merciful before and after we have sinned and repented. To remind us, God is merciful. Yeah, we mess up. We repent. God is still merciful. It is we who change, not God. You'll find a few things here from the Talmud Bavli. That's the Babylonian Talmud written about the year 500 AD, or in the Common Era. Interestingly, the latest document from the Vatican on the relationship between Jews and Christians also quotes from these Jewish sources. And we see this very, very clearly in this beautiful prayer, this affirmation of faith, the Shema. A prayer that we believe Jesus prayed. It's a prayer that Mark has in saying in chapter 12. Now, you've looked at that and you know, I know what that says. Can you notice that there is something repeated in this? You can? You can see the patterns. This is Shema. We're reading this way. Shema Yisrael Yod Hei Vav Hei. This is the eternal. These vowels here are the vowels for Adonai. That's how you can get Yeh, Ho, Va. You can actually get Jehovah from that if you read it wrongly. Elohim, Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen Israel, Shema Israel. Adonai, God who is mercy. Eloheinu, God who is justice. Adonai, God is mercy, just in case you didn't get it. Echad, God is one. And just to highlight those words there, this is the aspect of God's mercy and God who is just. God is merciful. We still face justice when we sin, when we miss the mark, when we fail in our realization of the ideal, but God is always merciful. There's a beautiful story. God spends all of God's time in heaven running. Didn't know God was a fitness freak, no? God spends all of God's time in heaven running. Why? Because God has two chairs, actually two thrones. We use a lot of royal language to talk about God. Okay? One throne is the throne of mercy. One throne is the throne of justice. And God spends all of God's time running between mercy and justice. But where does God spend most of God's time when God gets to sit down? In the throne of mercy. And we see here Jesus. You know, the lawyer. Anyone here studying law? Any lawyers? You know, if I was a lawyer, it's, you know, lawyers cop it bad in the New Testament. You know, it's one of the, you know, the lawyer, they're the smart aleck in the New Testament. So come on, Jesus, tell me, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus answered, the first is this, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. There in Mark's Gospel, this affirmation of faith, God is twice as merciful as God is just. You shall love this God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. There's a guy called Hillel said a similar thing around about the same time. He was a famous rabbi. He said, what is hurtful for you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. And just in case, where does this come from? Deuteronomy 6, 4, 5, and Leviticus 19, 18. How many people here have read the whole book of Leviticus? I studied it for a month in Israel, and I don't think I actually read the whole book. We went to the house of a famous rabbi's son, and he said, so what are you doing here in Jerusalem? I said, we're studying Leviticus. He said, why do you want to do that? I'll tell you why. And that's where I'll finish. Oh, this is nice. If you see the world with the vision of love, you will find everything so beautiful and meaningful. So last point. God is another... We talked about God balancing between this idea that God is judge and God is merciful. What I want to finish with is Leviticus. I can make this available if you want, and you can read the rest of it that I missed. Okay. Divine forbearance does not mean that sinners can expect wholly to escape the consequences of their misdeeds. Again, the Babylonian Talmud interprets the sentence to mean God remits punishment for the penitent, but not for the impenitent. Okay, we have to come to the party. God will forgive us, but we need to ask for forgiveness. It's repeated in Numbers. Here we go. Last bit. Leviticus 19, 1-2. The Eternal spoke to Moshe, which is Moses in Hebrew. In Arabic it would be Musa, saying, "Speak to the entire community of the children of Israel and say to them, Holy are you to be, for holy am I, the Eternal your God." And if you're only ever going to read one chapter of Leviticus, chapter 19, okay, it contains a summary of the Torah. It's at the heart of the Torah. It's kind of like the middle chapter of the whole Torah. And it contains some pretty radical ideas. But what does it mean? God is holy, therefore we should strive to be holy. God is merciful. God is a God of Rachum. God is a God of Hesed, of Hanun. Therefore we should be also. So finally, a Torah of compassion, meaning the God of mercy in the shared scriptures. And I think that's time, no?
Thank you, Professor Walsh. Let's try to give you once again a warm round of applause. So, quoting Professor Walsh, the question, have you found Jesus? Have you found Jesus? So as compared to an artist, maybe as religious educators, let us try to see beyond the reality and challenges all of us to encounter God very profoundly with the young people. So at this point, we're now open for questions, insights, or reflections. Yes, po.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I just want, can you please explain further chapter 34, verse 7, punishing children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generations?
Yep, that's an interesting thing. And I skipped over part of that. God is generous to the 1000th generation. But saying punishing the fathers and the sons of the fathers and the sons of the sons is a way of saying that quite often it is our children who face the consequences of what we do wrong. So remember that God is infinitely merciful, but we also have to face the consequences of when we do not live up to the ideal, the reign of God, the imitation of God. So the saying there is that, unfortunately, sometimes the consequences of what we do are only realized by our children or by our children's children. And with the crisis we're facing at the moment with the climate, I think that's an example of that. I think that's where the sins of my generation are going to affect my brothers and my sisters' children and their children. So it's not so much a sense of when the word punishing, I think, should be best expressed as facing the consequences of what was done wrong. But the balance is God is generous to the 1000th generation. So even though we might face this, God still hopes that we get it right. God still hopes that those who listen to God's word can show us how to do the right thing. God is still there, involved with us beyond that. So Does that answer that? Other questions?
Good afternoon, my name is June.
Hi, June.
First of all, let me just thank you for walking us through important concepts in the New Testament about mercy and compassion. Now, I have two related questions. First question is, do you see any continuity or discontinuity in terms of how Jesus would understand compassion and mercy? So that's the first question. And secondly, you spoke briefly about two traditions that are present in Torah, which is a God who is presented as somewhat violent, and how do you sort of balance it out in terms of the compassion and mercy that you spoke about?
Thank you so much. They're great questions. First of all, I would say, with regards to continuity and discontinuity, regarding the mercy and the compassion of God, I think there is absolute continuity between what the Old Testament says about the compassion of God and the mercy of God, and Jesus on preaching about that, teaching about that, living a life that exemplified that. I think there is, it is in continuity. And I think it's that continuity that helps us answer the second question. The text of the Old Testament was probably written down over a period of 500 years. But it contains stories that are probably at least another 1,000 years older than that. It is a story that is rooted in a political, land-bound, sometimes imperial reality. Are people who find themselves in a land, who have to live there, who have to create their own identity. And sometimes the biblical text, particularly the Old Testament, goes into places that the New Testament just doesn't go. Because the reality of the New Testament is it's a text that is displaced from a land. Because they're writing not in the place where Jesus lived, died and rose, but in Syria, maybe in Rome, maybe in parts of Turkey. It's a text that has been displaced. So the same sort of issues with regarding identity and space and identity and place are not there in the gospel. But the important thing is to do in a sense, and you see what the Jews have done with that passage, particularly Exodus 34, 6 and 7. That's given prominence. And the other texts are explained as we were trying to work out who we were. If we see God as involved in our life, sometimes there's been violence in our lives. And somehow we've got to come to grips with, is that because of God, or is it despite God, or, those sorts of things. So there are very difficult things. The same as if we take the New Testament, the idea that if I don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, I am out. That's a difficult thing as well. Maybe not for Christians, but for the majority of the other people in the world who are not Christian, that's a very significant thing. And maybe that's something we need to deal with as well. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Afternoon, Professor. Noel Salvacion of Kairos. As said, steadfast love is amongst the primest characteristics of God. Thank you for that. Now, in the interest of catechism, how do we answer our catechumens when they begin to raise the question about, is it said selective justice, Professor? I mean, shall we warrant death to the disobedient and the unenlightened? Since we are all creatures of clay, one day we too shall die. But why do we have to expedite the death of others? Why was even, I don't know if this is corollary question, why was the promised land given to Abraham when it was already owned by other people? There were already other people there. And God asked them, well, you can kill them.
Thank you. Again, these are important questions. With reference to the land, there are a number of ideologies concerning land in the Old Testament. For me, the most powerful is that the land belongs to God. It's there in Leviticus. That's another reason to read Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 18 and chapter 20. The land will vomit you out if you do not behave in the way that God requires. The limitation of the biblical text, however, is that it's political, is that it exists in the real world, is that it exists in a world where at that time war was far more acceptable than it is to many people now. Capital punishment was far more acceptable to many people than it is now. Unfortunately, we still live in a world that resorts to war. We still live in a world that engages in extrajudicial killings and things like this. For me, justice and this sense of God who is just is that we should fairly and within a sense of mercy and generosity deal with violence, deal with sin, deal with crime in a way that is fair. It's this struggle. I really don't know if I can answer your question adequately, but these are human texts trying to capture something of the divine, trying to live the ideal when the real is far more messy. And the real gets in the way. It's the same, I guess, as what we did as Christians during the Inquisition. You know, religion has been used very poorly by people. But somehow at the heart of that is God, who is ever faithful. God is waiting for us to return to God. God has shown us how we should live. For catechists, I guess that's it. You know, how do you experience God's faithfulness, God's chesed, God's steadfast love in your life? Most often it's through our parents, through our families, through the kindness of others, you know, through incredible examples like the story of the Good Samaritan and others. But on a related thing, I guess this it's there in a few questions now. This idea that the God of the Old Testament is this God of vindictiveness and violence, and the God of the New Testament is this God of love. I don't think it's that clear. There were some slides that I had that represented Judaism as someone who had fallen, someone who had the crown taken off her head, and Christianity is represented as this. Okay? This is the crime of Christianity. Our crime of Christianity. Here we have Judaism, the staff is broken, the Torah is falling out of her hand, she has a blindfold on. We have the nerve to say that the Jews don't know how to read their own scripture. And there is Christianity, looking down on Judaism. I guess, and even the Pope does it in the document, the papal bull. He says, you know, the Pharisees were just about law. They gave people this burden. All my Jewish friends don't see the Torah as a burden. I don't think Jesus saw the Torah as a burden. I think Jesus followed the Torah pretty much. He argued about how to interpret some parts of it, such as Sabbath. But most of all, in some cases, he even tried to make it more strict. You have heard it said, but I say, you know. So the last image, because it's, I think there's either time for one more question or time to finish this, is this beautiful statue which was created last year to commemorate 50 years of Nostra Aetate, which is the Church's statement on its relationship with other religious traditions, other people of goodwill, other people whom we experience God's chesed through. And here is the church and the synagogue, the Christian and the Jew, sitting together as equals, sitting together as women of dignity, learning from one another's scriptures. Learning that those scriptures are complex, that sometimes they contain things that are difficult, but they also contain great wisdom, and they reveal something of God to us. And I think that is, for me, this lasting message of God, a God of mercy, a God of compassion that we experience in the Torah.
Thank you, Professor. So if you still have some clarifications and questions, you can approach him later. So to show our appreciation of Professor's inputs and sharing, let us call once again Dr. Rito Barding and Mr. Ruel Rito Senio to give the award certificate.
The Salle University College of Liberal Arts, Theology and Religious Education Department, in cooperation with the Religious Educators Association of the Philippines, awards this certificate of appreciation to Professor Mark David Walsh for his invaluable contribution as speaker in the Summer Institute on Sacred Scriptures 2016 with the theme, The Bible and the Extraordinary Jubilee Year of Mercy. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous but sinners. Given this 13th day of May 2016 at the Teresa Yuchengco Seminar Rooms, 507 to 509, Salle University, Manila, Philippines. Signed by yours truly, and of course the trend chairperson, Dr. Rito B. Barding. Give Professor Walsh.